We talk about cottage planning issues. The first thing that we need to do is sort of get all together in terms of what kinds of things are we talking about. What is a cottage? And for my purposes and for purposes of the discussion today, a cottage is any property the owners wish to keep in the family for more than one generation. When we talk of a cottage, we typically talk about a physical structure. But it's not required that we have a residence on the vacation property. I've worked with a number of families that have 80 acres of vacant land, and they have every bit as much interest in keeping that land intact for younger generations. So really what we're focusing on, though, is the idea that people have property they want to pass on to younger generations within the family. Another concept that is worth getting our arms around is what is a cottage plan. And again, for our purposes, it's any agreement that describes how a cottage will be shared and passed on to future generations. I think any lawyer would tell you that the most effective way of dealing with a plan is to have it in writing. And that hopefully will go a long way toward avoiding misunderstandings as the younger generations come into ownership. But we simply want an agreement that describes how the cottage will be shared. That is, how will it be managed, how will decisions be made, and so forth. And then how will it be passed on, how will ownership be passed on to younger generations. If we look at the typical plan, certainly the ones that I am involved with, they have certain characteristics. They cover certain topics. The first is who should own it. And I would tell you that virtually every family that comes to me with an interest in doing a cottage plan has a sincere interest in identifying the people who will be eligible owners of the property going forward. Who should manage it? How do you manage it? How do you create a structure, an infrastructure for making decisions? Who should pay for it? When mom and dad are no longer available to write the checks to cover all of the expenses, the cost of maintaining the property becomes a huge issue for the next generation. So who should pay for it becomes a critical issue to deal with. What if an owner wants or needs out? And I would share with you that in the hundreds of families that I've worked with, it is not at all uncommon for there to be a shakeout of ownership once every generation. And so even if you have multiple children, 3, 4, 5 children in the next generation, don't be surprised if not each one of them has the same degree of interest in staying connected with the property. And there are a lot of legitimate reasons why somebody may want out, but the typical cottage plan needs to have some safety valve, some escape mechanism, so that if one of the owners wants out, there doesn't have to be an extended negotiation between among the siblings in terms of what that exit is going to look like. Who gets to use it? One of the big issues is how do you define the use and enjoyment of the property? Who's eligible to use the property? And along with that is how should use be scheduled? And scheduling is either relatively insignificant if you have a few number of people at the next generation and enough space so that anybody can come at any time, or it can become one of the most contentious issues if you have a lot of people and a relatively small space, and there needs to be some mechanism for deciding who's coming and when, and how does everybody in the family get to have a sense that they had first choice at some point. One of the things that I encourage all families to keep in mind as we start down the path of doing a cottage plan is that there's two ways to look at vacation property, and neither one is right or wrong. And I can tell most parents that if you have more than 3 kids at the next generation, you're going to have some in each camp. The first way to look at the property is as an asset of considerable economic value. And because vacation property has enjoyed significant appreciation in value over particularly the last 20 or 25 years, it is not at all surprising that for some families that I work with, the vacation property becomes the single largest economic asset in mom and dad's estate. And if you are looking at it from an economic standpoint, and that's a legitimate way to view the property, you're going to come out on different sides of some of the dilemmas and some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So one way to look at the property is with dollar signs as an economic asset. But another way of looking at the property is that it is a family retreat that we want to keep intact for younger generations of the family to enjoy. And the whole idea of defining the property in economic terms really is irrelevant in that case, because your whole thrust is to keep the property in the family and not liquidate it, so that whatever its fair market value might be at any given time is largely inconsequential. But you can see that the difference in these two views is substantial, and within any one family, I suspect that there's going to be some people in both camps. And that's going to lead to some very contentious issues if we don't have a cottage plan in place that will deal with those issues and eliminate the need for negotiation among the siblings. Now, as we go through this, one other sort of defining issue that is helpful is who the various parties are. And one term that has been coined is the founders, and the founders are in this little schematic, Tom and Mary Parker. They are the oldest living generation that has ownership of the vacation property. All of the heirs, and you can see that they have 3 children, Andy, Bob, and Carol. Andy has 3 kids, Carol has 2, and Bob has none. And that's not at all an unusual arrangement where there are multiple children at the next generation to have different numbers of grandchildren with respect to each child. So we then have the grandchildren below the first level of heirs, and we will be talking about branches. And a branch is simply a collection of descendants that is defined by the first branch underneath the founders, the first generation underneath the founders. So we have an Andy's branch, a Bob's branch, and a Carol's branch in this example.